Non giudicate se non volete essere giudicati. Con quel giudizio col quale giudicherete sarete giudicati, e con quella misura con la quale misurerete sarete misurati. Perché osservi la pagliuzza che è nell'occhio di tuo fratello, mentre della trave che nell'occhio tuo non t'accorgi?
Ragazzi, mi si smonta tutto. Il film non si fa più. Quei giorni qua non ci deve essere più niente. Bisogna cominciare subito. Coraggio, al lavoro, buttate giù. Dico bene, autore?
Sì, grazie. Arrivederci, ragazzi. Ci vediamo in un prossimo film.
Lo speriamo.
Ciao, marinai.
Welcome to Cinema Italia, a podcast dedicated to the world of Italian cinema. Presented by me, John Bleasdale. Everybody, and welcome to Cinema Italia. My name's John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and a film critic, and today I'm talking with Matthew Page, and we're talking about Pier Paolo Pasolini's The Gospel According to St. Matthew. Hi, Matthew. And by the way, I should introduce you a little bit more because you've been on our sister podcast, Writers on Film, where we were talking about your book. Oh, I forget the number. Is it 100 Bible?
It is, yeah.
Okay, just wanted to get
100 Bible films, yeah.
Yeah, not a decalogue because that would be too short.
No.
So happy that you, even though this is becoming a little bit of a Pasolini-heavy podcast.
Yeah, I was listening to your Abel Ferrara one earlier.
That was entertaining, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I hope it didn't. I mean, he's just so worth talking to because he's just popping with ideas.
Yeah.
And a friend of mine sent me a message that they'd just gone for dinner with him that same night, and they said, "Oh, he really calms down when there's no one there." You know, it's kind of a little bit of a nervous energy, I think. What did you think of what he said about Pasolini?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was kind of really interesting. It's kind of really interesting because I think both the way he was kind of like, it was obviously hugely influential on him as a director. And yet it was he was fairly kind of comfortable going to the things that he was perhaps less on board with, which is, I think it's quite rare, particularly for someone that goes to the extreme of making a whole film about someone and has that kind of interest in him and reveres him so much to also be able to kind of stand back and, ask a couple of questions that perhaps don't get asked very often. Yeah, so I thought it was, that was interesting from that perspective, and it's such an interesting film, such an interesting way to investigate a filmmaker and to explore their work is to kind of actually make a film about them. It's kind of, I guess, different from writing about them or watching their movies, is to kind of enter that space and do it. So it's, he's kind of got quite an interesting perspective.
Yeah, it always reminds me of Harold Bloom's old concept of the anxiety of influence, where you have to go and you have to kill your sort of progenitor, you're the person who most influences you. And that sort of it literally in Pasolini, he kind of has, because of the way Pasolini dies as well, you are sort of reenacting that sort of violent golden bough-like succession.
That's an interesting point,
So, I mean, this is, for me, if somebody said, I really want to watch some Pasolini, what would you suggest? The Gospel According to St. Matthew isn't the most typical Pasolini, but I think it's perhaps his most accessible film.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I mean, he doesn't really have typical films in some ways. I think his kind of output varies so much, and certainly it's obviously a much more accessible film than Salo. Someone asked the question recently, is there ever a film that you would never recommend to anyone, or words to that effect? And I think Salo is a brilliant piece of filmmaking, but I'm not sure I could I don't ever imagine being in a situation where I kind of encourage someone to see it. I wouldn't discourage people from seeing it, but it's you have to kind of come to that conclusion yourself, I think. And in a way, I suppose Il Vangelo secondo Matteo is at the opposite extreme in that respect. I think there's a lot of the ideas that Pasolini, both at the time was exploring, but also went on, that are kind of largely absent from this film, and it's kind of and so it is a kind of his most successful film, and I think particularly when people are familiar with the story, which perhaps less so than at the time he made it, but I think compared to some of the other works he adapts, then it's a better known story than say even works like Oedipus Rex or Medea. So definitely from that point of view,
the Canterbury Tales he has a go at, and the Decameron as well, I think.
Yeah, and some of those works are vast works, and he just kind of picks a few stories from here and there, and so it is probably also the one where there's perhaps the least cutting away of huge chunks of stuff. He kind of largely tells the story to roughly this time it would take to read it, although slightly less, but again, relative to those longer works.
No, absolutely. The Gospels being a very sort of austere in some ways texts. They're all killer, no filler. If that's not, I'm sorry, I'm becoming incredibly disrespectful. Let's put this a little bit in context. So Pasolini's making this in 1962.
64.
Oh, sorry, 1964. You're right,
Yeah.
absolutely. I'm getting it mixed up. I've just recently watched Boccaccio 70, Boccaccio 70, which is made in 1962. That's where that's coming from.
Yeah.
My apologies. Yes, so he's making it in 1964. It's a black and white film when cinema is black and white films are still around, but cinema is transitioning into color. Where is this in Pasolini's career?
Well, I think it's quite a kind of interesting turning point in a lot of ways. He started making films in '61 with mine's gone blank. Acatone, yeah. Thank you, Acatone, yeah. And then quickly followed that with Mamma Roma, and those, his kind of first couple of films. But he's kind of exploring this idea, I guess, a lot. There's a kind of sense of optimism a little bit about him. I mean, he's never particularly a kind of happy-go-lucky kind of director, but I think certainly as we go through his career, his kind of work gets a bit darker and less hopeful. And I think really Il Vangelo is a kind of bit of a key point in that. I think from that point onwards, things start to kind of move a bit darker in his filmography. The other thing that I think is quite crucial for where he is as an artist in this period is he's having made Acatone and Mamma Roma, he then makes another one of these kind of portmanteau films, or contributes to another one of those portmanteau films with his film La Ricotta, which is also crucifixion focused, also kind of focused on the Jesus story. But this is a story about the kind of behind the scenes of making a Jesus film. And this was, it seems very tame for anyone who watches it today, but actually ended him up getting prosecuted and getting suspended sentence because it was considered so disrespectful to the kind of Italian national religion. And so this kind of came out the year before the film we're talking about today, Il Vangelo secondo Matteo. And so it's quite an interesting, I guess, response to all of that. And then there's also issues that are running alongside it, such as his relationship to the kind of Italian Communist Party, PC, and I guess also the stuff that's kind of happening in the Catholic Church as well, and his relationship in that as well. So it's quite a kind of full on period for him, I think.
Yeah, he's in an absolute maelstrom of I mean, I think it's easy for us sometimes to look at these great figures and not quite understand how difficult it is to be. I mean, any one of these things would have you anathematized from Italian society in the 1960s. Being an atheist, outspoken atheist, being a communist, outspoken communist, being gay. I mean, the way his sexuality is kind of public knowledge is fascinating as well. Any one of those things would be enough to sink most people, and yet here he is writing novels, writing poetry, making films. And I think actually a point from the Abel Ferrara conversation, which is interesting, is how he talks about how Pasolini, despite especially later on in his career, going into sort of the trilogy of death and going into a darker period, continuously is making stuff. So no matter what he's saying about, oh, it's hopeless, culture is dying, capitalism is winning, he's never stops producing work.
Yeah, that was really interesting, wasn't it?
Yeah, that sort of consumerism is, and I mean, there's a huge contradiction there, just because consumerism as an ideology, you can hate it, but then it reminds me of Steve Martin in The Jerk. You know, I don't want the money, I just want the stuff. You know, it's that's my politics. I don't want money. Money's evil, but I do want the stuff and the air tickets and that sort of stuff.
I mean, his whole kind of anti-capitalism thing is it kind of a fascinating driver. I mean, throughout it's perhaps the most consistent thing throughout his career, really. And I think partly why things tend to get darker after this film. But this film is very much about that. You know, and that kind of. I mean, essentially, he grew up in. You might have to help me with the pronunciation here, but Friuli, is that?
Friuli, yes, Friuli.
Yeah. So he grew up he grew up there in a kind of fairly rural context, and his kind of mum's family was from that peasant background. His father's family was had a bit more of an aristocracy kind of background, and I think he kind of had to leave there. I mean, you mentioned about him being gay earlier. He had to kind of leave there after a kind of scandal up there related to that, and so he kind of ends up coming to Rome. But from then on, really, there's this kind of sense that he's trying to get back to something about that way of life and that kind of to use his kind of word, primitive kind of existence behind it. And he finds it at first in the slums in Rome, and the kind of what he calls sub-proletariat in Rome, which is what kind of leads him to make Acatone. And later he starts to kind of see it in the Italian South, and particularly, this film is very much a kind of film about the Italian South, and then later on within the kind of global South. But essentially, he sees that capitalism is kind of squeezing the life out. This more archaic, religious kind of spiritual, sacred sense in the world. He sees that's getting kind of strangled out by capitalism, and it's starting to lose its grip, and this seems to be the thing that he is increasingly depressing him as he goes on.
And that's what I think many people were surprised when this film came out, and it wasn't satirical. It wasn't Lara Cotta. It wasn't going that route. It was actually, Scorsese has cited it as one of his main influences in The Last Temptation of Christ, and Scorsese is a devout Catholic.
I think Scorsese wanted to make a Jesus film, and then he saw Pasolini's version, and he said, basically ruined him. He kind of had to scrap all his plans because it was, what he'd been thinking of doing. So
right,
he said I was moved and crushed at the same time by Pasolini's film.
That's an interesting thing, and he has to sort of find another angle to get in there. And he kind of, Last Temptation of Christ, at the risk of a quick diversion into Scorsese land, is so interesting as a sort of, because it's kind of a gangster movie. It's kind of like, it's got Jesus in it, but it's Harvey Keitel. No more crosses,
It's very much, it's kind of, in terms of its location, it sits out on its own in a way. But so many of Scorsese's themes are so prevalent in that film, and particularly, there's kind of, I guess just the kind of the idea of the gang and the best friend and the and the conflicts and the violence and the getting in over your depth type, all those kind of themes that come up again and again are very much in that film. So yeah, it does take a very different angle from it and work it quite productively, I think. So.
But I think, going back to what you were talking about, the anti-capitalism, which is a strand that goes all the way through. With this film, I think that's where he finds his, the similarities, the things which coincide with religion. And, he dedicates the film to Pope Giovanni, who was, famously was sort of like nominated the good Pope, which also shows you how many what opinion people generally had of the popes, that a good one felt exceptional enough to give a title like that to. And you get religion, people often quote the Marx sort of aphorism about religion is the opium of the masses, but the end of that quote is religion is the heart in a heartless world. That's not opium is pretty good when you haven't got any painkillers, and having a heart in a heartless world is very attractive. So I think that his the coincidence of communism and religion in this film is not quite as antithetical and not quite surprising as I think a lot of us take it for.
No, I think Pasolini saw them as being, great complements to each other, and I think his hope really was this film would bring these two aspects of his personality into dialogue, and these two kind of things he related to. As you said, he was an atheist, but he was also, there's a kind of famous quote that he may or may not have said, but I may be an unbeliever, but I'm an unbeliever who has nostalgia for belief. And he also kind of describes himself as the least Catholic of all the Italians I know, which is again is a really interesting quote, because it still kind of presupposes the fact that he is, in some ways he's grown up in that Italian culture and is in this inescapably Catholic culture, and those influences are there. And so for him, I think he kind of thought that perhaps a lot of the Marxism, the communism that was around was a bit dry and kind of too kind of head based, and it needed a bit more of the kind of the spirit of I'm struggling to remember the precise word he uses in this for some of the stuff, but also that the kind of Marxism could influence Christianity to be a more, or Catholicism to be a more thought out and approachable topic as well, and so I think his hope was to bring the two sides together, but I don't think it was particularly successful in that respect.
In terms of like it's the public conversation, you mean?
Yeah.
Right.
And so I think it probably kind of, a lot of his kind of communist contacts, I wouldn't necessarily say friends, but they kind of thought he kind of lost his mind with doing this, and kind of felt him to be selling out. And it, the film went down well in some sections of the church, although there was kind of bits of back and forwarding on that as well. But yeah, I think certainly it didn't kind of bridge that gap in the way he'd hoped.
So let's get into the film itself. First thing I wanted to ask you, Matthew, is I'm interested in the choice of gospel as well, because I went to Catholic school, and I remember we sort of concentrated on the Gospel of St. Mark, as that was sort of considered the most Catholic gospel. I don't know if that's coming from anywhere further than the school I was at, or whether that's a generally recognized thing. St. Matthew's Gospel is, of course, it's your name as well, so that's why you're happy about that.
Yeah, always draws me into it.
Yeah, exactly. I prefer John. In the beginning was the Word, and I'm a writer, so that's perfect for me. Matthew was also the basis, I think, for Mel Gibson's The Passion. I think he drew.
Well, yeah, he kind of draws. Gibson draws from various, I think from all four really to different degrees, and perhaps Mark least of all, but then Mark's perhaps the least distinctive in that space. But certainly there are elements of Matthew's Gospel in there that in Gibson's film. It is a really interesting choice for Pasolini. The kind of the story goes that he was in Assisi to kind of visit a Christian group down there, and he got trapped into his hotel room because the Pope was visiting there at the same time, and so he's kind of stuck in the hotel room with nothing to do, and he kind of flips to his Bible there. I don't know if they have the Gideons in Italy or not, but same deal. And he kind of basically was just transfixed by reading Matthew's gospel and the kind of the force of the energy running through it, and and the whole thing really. And so that was the one he ended up making. I wonder if there's a certain amount of mythology around his kind of telling of the story of that, but certainly he thought that Matthew's was the gospel that he really moved him. And the other ones, I'm just trying to find this quote that I pulled out, but I can't find it. But basically, he kind of thought that Luke was too bourgeois, and John was a bit, he kind of thought of all of them, this was the most one, and I think this was the one that he thought had that revolutionary spirit most in it. I think he kind of, and he does, and he portrays Jesus very much as this kind of Marxist revolutionary character. Oh yeah, here's the quote: Marx seemed too crude, John's too mystical, and Luke's sentimental and bourgeois. So so that's why he kind of went there. And saying, someone who walks up to a couple of people and says, "Drop your nets and follow me," is a total revolutionary. So so that was the sense that he really got with it. And I think particularly, he kind of condensed. Naturally, kind of condenses and cuts out a lot of the material, but he particularly focuses on this one chapter that he leaves almost entirely untouched. Is from the end, where he kind of Jesus delivers this very forthright, shall we say, speech to the kind of the leaders, and that is the one chapter that is kind of left untouched, and it's this kind of furious rant shot over several different kind of scenes and locations, but and I think that's really seemed to be what really got him going with it. So there's quite a lot. It's quite a deliberate choice, I think, of Matthew.
One thing I would add to that is I think Matthew's the one which is the sort of more argumentative. I think the reason I read about Gibson using it, people were sort of picking up on of all the Gospels, it's the sort of most anti-Semitic, in the sense that it's very much an internal argument with Jews, with the Jewish community, and leaving any potential anti-Semitism aside, the idea in the film is that there is arguments with the priestly sort of. Now, if we allow for the fact that this is also a communist film, or a film about Pasolini's relationship with communism, as you've already sort of indicated, then the priests can also be read as sort of apparatchiks, the upper echelons of party. Stalinist bureaucracy, and Jesus as a young revolutionary is sort of the next generation that doesn't necessarily want to deal with 1917 and all the rules that have been put in place, the Comintern, etc.
And again, certainly that passage, if you kind of look at that through that lens, it kind of lends itself very very well to that kind of, because it's it's a lot about the the blind guides and putting restrictions on people that's stopping them being able to do stuff. So those, in some ways, he kind of de-Judaizes the elements of it quite a lot. And he kind of Pasolini loved a good kind of piece of headgear throughout his career, but he kind of has these kind of very notable large hats on the kind of the leaders in this situation, and on a kind of, from an artistic point of view, they relate to, I think it's Pietro della Francesca, it's one of kind of his paintings, but also there's a kind of resemblance to kind of Bishop's mitres, and so it kind of lines up those characters, in a few potential different directions. So certainly there's a kind of anti-clericalism in there, but I think also, again, trying to kind of bring the two together, but maybe by critiquing both sides a little bit as well. So
Let's talk a little bit about Jesus, because any Jesus film is kind of only as good as its Jesus, I think.
Yeah.
If you don't have Willem Dafoe, if you don't have Robert Powell, Max von Sydow, it's those performances which are really going to, because it's more than just playing a character. You have to have a sort of charisma. And I think this film is one of the most spectacularly successful in that regard.
Yeah, it is. I mean, even though, I think we have to kind of mention the monobrow before we go too much further. But
I'm glad you're the one that brought that
up. But it is a fantastic portrayal, and it's, the Enrico Irizacoui, he's an interesting story with him as well. And so he was a 19-year-old Spanish student, so he's one of the youngest people ever to kind of play Jesus in a major film like this. And so he was a fan of Pasolini's book, and I think he was in Rome, and he kind of just on a chance kind of said to Pasolini, would you, could I come and meet you and say hello? And Pasolini said yes. And then I think Pasolini was then transfixed straight away by him, and kind of asked him then and there if he fancied being Jesus, and he didn't seem to be that keen initially, but he kind of beat him into it. And it is a great performance. And also it's but the voice is not his voice. So his voice is Enrico Salerno, who kind of dubbed various other bits and pieces and appeared in a few films himself. And and it's quite an interesting contrast between the kind of the figure and the kind of angry faces and body language of Irizacoui, and Salerno's kind of like booming angry voice coming out at the same time. And so it's a very I think what tends to hit people with it is when they first watch it, and certainly at the time, is how angry the character of Jesus is, and it's quite often called the kind of the angry Jesus film or whatever. But it's quite surprising that quite often actually he does smile, and he is quite relatable, particularly in the presence of children, the kind of innocence and other scenarios. We do kind of see, certainly compared to, you mentioned Max von Sydow, certainly compared to his Jesus, he's a much more believable and human character, even if he has got a bit of a temper on him. But I think that's what makes it such a magnetic performance. I think is just that kind of steely-eyed determination about the whole thing, and the way Pasolini shoots him as well. He's kind of, one of the I guess the most memorable shots is off the back of Jesus' head, as he's kind of like, because he's kind of constantly doing this kind of storming around, doing this, marching around, and the camera's almost struggling to kind of keep up with him as he goes. And so it's just a really forceful portrayal.
Absolutely, and I'm glad you mentioned the how he's filmed, because the cinematography here by Tonino Delle Colle, absolutely legendary Italian cinematographer, does lots of the new wave. When Jesus is introduced, it just sort of does this wonderful shot where it sort of tracks him as he moves through a crowd, and it's a very shallow focus. So it's almost like the zoom is picking him out from almost like a documentary, and it just follows him, and he seems to be almost like gliding through this crowd towards John the Baptist, and it's just so. You just see, you feel like Pasolini must have felt when he first met him. You're enraptured by him, and it's
and you've got Odetta going on in the soundtrack as well at the same time in that shot, haven't you?
Absolutely,
just kind of adds to that. Sorry.
No, absolutely, you're right, and I think it's also it's one of those things which Pasolini does, which I don't think is particularly subversive. I think it's actually quite congruent with Italian Catholicism, is that he masters the sort of erotic charge of Jesus. Everybody follows him because everybody kind of fancies him.
Certainly he's obviously a very attractive actor, and I think superstars today and kind of they're almost so kind of slick that he doesn't fit into that bracket at all. But in terms of that kind of 60s Alain Delon type, the kind of Alan Bates type, the kind of slightly rough around the edges figure. He's very much in that mold, and he's a very, very magnetic presence.
And you mentioned earlier as well about the locations. I mean, there was originally the idea was they were going to go off and film this in Palestine and things like that. I think more or less every Bible movie starts with that, as maybe the publicity department has the same sort of. But it's filmed almost entirely in Italy. Partly in Sicily, I think, for the scenes with him going off into the desert is actually Etna, which is
that's right, which he returns to with Tirima, doesn't he?
Absolutely, a wonderful, wonderful shot towards the end where the guy's naked on Etna. A photograph, a scene which I reenacted. You'll be happy to know last Easter, not nude. I hasten to add, but I did this. I did the shouting. In Etna, on Etna, I should say. And of course, the town which is used is Matera, which was more recently seen in the latest James Bond film.
Was it? I hadn't.
That's the town.
I hadn't picked that up.
That's the town at the very beginning where he's sort of driving around with Léa Seydoux.
But he uses it quite a lot, doesn't he? Matera. It kind of stands in for various places in the Jerusalem, sort of Nazareth, and
Yeah, and I mean, in a way, this makes Pasolini sort of similar to Renaissance painters, where a lot of biblical scenes you sort of like, wait a minute, that's a hill outside Florence. What's that doing in Galilee? Those are cypresses, and they're more that looks like just outside of Rome rather than Palestine.
I think that was very much his intention, though. I mean, he kind of. I mean, the thing about the shooting on location in Palestine, he's kind of a bit contradictory about that. So he kind of sometimes, he made the film. When he went to Palestine, he went with a kind of Catholic priest to kind of scout it out, and they then released this film with some of the footage called Sopralluigi in Palestina per Il Vangelo secondo Matteo, scouting for locations for the Gospel according to Matthew. And in that, he kind of goes through this thing and looks at it, and it all kind of looks a bit too modern. He talks about the landscape being a bit spoiled, but in other places he talks about how the fact he kind of more or less decided that he wanted to do it in the South anyway. And I think it's because of that. It's trying to again capture that kind of epic, spirituality, epic sacredness, which he for him was kind of like in the faces of the people around there. And because also he's trying to tell the story by using a series of kind of analogies in his work. And so, I mean, I think so he's kind of, so he's not, I think people often think he's, trying to kind of use Matera to pass for Jerusalem, which is a bit like, I mean, Mel Gibson shot some of the Passion there as well, and that was what he was trying to do. Whereas almost I think Pasolini is trying to kind of bring these parallels of what for him was modern day, but I think almost for us 60 years later, I mean, you've already mentioned the kind of black and white thing versus the color, but also that gap of 60 years as well, but also perhaps the difference between where the kind of Italian South was at that stage in the early 60s, and the kind of gap between there culturally and the North was huge at that time. And so I think people quite often see some of the choices Pasolini makes and almost kind of don't really realize that they're almost like places that were and things that were kind of 20th century, because they seem much older than that. But actually there is a kind of, he is trying to kind of pick out that area in that region and some of those things. And Matera was, Matera today is a kind of UNESCO site, isn't it? And the Sassi, where it was shot. But but at the time it was completely looked down on, and it wasn't, and wasn't valued as a place at all. And part of the reason that it got that UNESCO status was because Pasolini went there shot the film, and they kind of, people started realizing what a valuable thing it was. But
I think what's really interesting, and this goes back to the ricotta as well, is when I rewatched it in preparation for talking to you, there's I feel this with almost all Pasolini's films, even though I've seen La Ricotta, which is very much about here's a film and here's outside of the film.
Yeah.
There doesn't ever seem to be an outside of the film to his films. There's no sense that if you move the camera to the left, you would see a bunch of people, dressed in modern dress holding a boom, and the catering truck is over there, and partly because if you did see those things, as in La Ricotta, their life would be similarly Pasoliniano. Their life would similarly, would be within that universe. There are bits of this film which really convince me that I am watching something which is entirely in its own universe in a way that I don't feel that with The Passion. I don't feel, it's a little bit like, the Quest for the Holy Grail. It's only a model. That sense of inescapable moviness about it. This has moments of real strangeness that are just totally its own. I'll give you an example. When the Archangel just turns up and it's indicated by the sound of children playing suddenly disappearing. That's just something that is so stunningly simple and yet uncanny and weird that he just seems to have these amazingly simple ways of conveying something utterly mysterious and unknowable.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think he just does these, very kind of simple things, and he was kind of, people almost thought when he first did Acatone that they didn't really get what he was doing, and he was almost kind of criticized for being quite naive and not having really got a grasp of it. And he played along to that slightly, but he just has these incredible ideas and these ways of putting things across. And it's really interesting saying that, because I think people often it's often said that this is a kind of neorealist film. With Pasolini was very against that idea. I think he never saw any of his work as neorealist, because for him the neorealists were, partly he saw them as being a kind of response to fascism, and that being a kind of time that had now passed, but also that for him that the kind of neorealists were trying to kind of make it look like reality, even though that was essentially a falsehood, that it was reality. It wasn't reality. Whereas what he was trying to do was kind of quite happily use lots of different mixtures of things. He talks about this idea of contamination and bringing these things into opposites with each other, and so he's not really trying to kind of produce a reality, and yet he also kind of, as you say, brings this kind of really, this unusual combinations, just these very kind of moving moments. I mentioned the Odetta song before, but
the Motherless Child, which is just like perfect.
Yeah.
What a perfect choice. And that black spiritual,
and it just and again, it's, the kind of the types of music are all, you never find that mix of music in a neorealist film. And it's very, if you sit there and think about it and analyze it and say, it's, those things are all quite jarring and out of place, and yet somehow when it brings those things together, it still has this kind of sublime nature about it, and as you say, a kind of really just a kind of real power, and just makes these moving moments throughout the film.
Because it's weird, because there's a real paradox here, because in one sense I'm saying there's a certain authenticity to it, where I'm not thinking of you're right, it's not a sort of pretend documentary, and it's not Joseph's haircut is post-war Italian. It's not year zero, it's 1 year, 9 months before Christ, I guess would be the most accurate dating. it's basically he's just, he could be in a vest watching the football on a portable TV. So there are loads of bits but he sort of somehow grasps a timelessness. For instance, and we've already mentioned this, so it's worth maybe bringing up again. For instance, his treatment of children. The children behave in a way that children have behaved all the time, and so that's an element of sort of uncontrollable reality, which is just there in front of the camera. And it there's my church bell going for
right on cue.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah. Go ahead, Matthew.
Well, yeah, I mean, he does a whole lot with the kind of. I think one of the reasons as well it feels that it's because of the way he does focus on all these characters that aren't the main characters. I mean, obviously there's a lot of attention on Jesus, but then there's quite a big drop between any of the other kind of characters emerging. But it kind of casts it wide, and so you get all these incredible kind of close-ups of people. I mean, I think something like there's a video essayist who's kind of basically cut out all the non-close-ups in the film, and he reckons 40% of the film is close-ups.
Wow.
And they're just, and again, this gives it this kind of timelessness because the focus so much is on the faces, and they're the faces of children at times, they're the faces of old toothless men, of middle-aged women, beautiful young men, and the whole, but there's just so much focus on that element, and I think that almost surpasses the kind of costume drama thing because it's that focus on the eyes and the human face, and that the kind of looking into the soul, I suppose, perhaps. And I'm kind of reminded of Carl Theodor Dreyer as well, who was a huge influence of Pasolini and his Joan of Arc film. Again, huge percentage of close-ups in that film, but the kind of the fabled thing that he did was he got, they built this incredible, expensive set for that movie, and then Dreyer just shot all the faces. But I think that kind of spirit is in this film as well, because you've got all the things you could be showing, and the kind of the scenery and all the other things, but it's just that real focus on something as simple as the human face, and the kind of and it's the telling of the story by the reactions that's so fascinating. The kind of it's almost it kind of takes that reaction shot thing to another level, because so much of it is done by people just sitting there and listening and very imperceptibly, but that being the thing that kind of moves the story on, and the kind of the reactions to who Jesus is.
Absolutely, and that then sort of it's as we go on, we're moving inevitably towards sort of the tragedy of Christ and the story of the crucifixion, that moment of which again in the 1960s, I guess in every era has different resonances. This is a post-war, post-Holocaust film about the crucifixion. It's not, it has that 20th century history in it as well. It can't escape it.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean it's quite interesting. The kind of style of filmmaking changes a little bit towards the kind of end of the film. It becomes the kind of close-ups are much less. And perhaps one of the most famous scenes is when Jesus is being tried, and this is one of the scenes that is, I suppose, is quite, in a lot of Jesus films, is played in a way that it's kind of problematically anti-Semitic, or kind of in a way that is recycling some of those stereotypes. And with Pasolini, I think we get. I mean, I've read a couple of different Jewish scholars on this, and even they kind of disagree as to whether Pasolini is kind of Judaizes it enough that his inclusion of, one of the kind of most damaging verses in Matthew's gospel is his blood be on us and our people, which in Mel Gibson's film he eventually didn't subtitle but still had in the original translation, which was a weird decision. Pasolini includes it here, and I mean, I guess a lot of the kind of key work within the Catholic Church happened very soon after Pasolini's film, but they kind of made quite a lot of statements about what was and wasn't a good idea in this context. Pasolini's working without that context, so I think that's important to kind of remember a little bit. So he does include that line, but that whole scene is shot in this kind of courtyard. But it's a fairly small courtyard, so there isn't the kind of Gibson-esque heaving crowd. Well, Gibson's Zeffirelli, various for the director, this kind of heaving, massive crowd, all pushing, desperate to see him killed. The setup here is very different. On the far side of the courtyard, we have this kind of like, these leader figures and Jesus and the kind of cross-examining him, and then there's a huge gap across the courtyard, and then just around the edge, around the other three edges, or two edges at least, is this crowd, this kind of 2 or 3 deep level crowd, and there's this, and there's a kind of real reticence there, and the camera during these scenes is in the crowd and kind of like bobbing in and out, and Jesus is almost kind of out of focus, and you lose sight of him behind someone else's head and all this kind of stuff, and so it is an interesting, I think, attempt to kind of grapple with some of that stuff and to try and perhaps to kind of conscious of that post-Holocaust context and trying to re-wrestle with some of those things.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think that's really interesting as well, because there's a sort of fetishization somewhat of Pontius Pilate in that sort of we sort of see him as Saint Paul cozying up to the Romans. He wasn't that bad. He wasn't the whereas in fact historically he was a really vile figure.
Oh yeah. I mean he got sacked in the end for being too violent. So if you're too violent for the Romans, who are the people who invented crucifixion as a mass punishment method, then that really puts that in context. And as you said, and so many, I mean, Pilate's in this only very briefly anyway, but so many of the kind of Jesus films show, Pilate as this kind of, certainly relative to his kind of Jewish counterparts, or even the idea of that their counterparts is completely fallacious, because, the Romans were in charge, they had the army, the Jewish people were conquered. And so, but there's almost a kind of nobility or respectability about Pilate in a lot of these films. I think the best example actually is Last Temptation, which we mentioned earlier, where Pilate's played by an actual pop star.
David Bowie.
Yeah. And so it's and so I've lost my thread now, but
it's kind of the what is truth element. It's like, ooh, what a cool guy, what a snappy phrase, and the washing of the hands and everything.
And obviously the what is truth passage is not here because that's John, not Matthew,
right?
So yeah.
Well, when I think this is a bit of a crass question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because how do you feel that this the crucifixion, which is sort of like it's well, I mean, Mel Gibson makes almost the entire film about that. How does this compare? How does Pasolini's treatment of it differ, and how does he do something which isn't repeating what's already been done?
Well, I mean, it's over fairly quickly, and it's
he doesn't linger on it, does he?
No, he doesn't. I think probably the most innovative thing he does is the kind of the more documentary type feel camera work, which, as I say, there's this kind of big contrast between these amazing close-ups, but also this kind of news footage style footage that he puts in, and there are a couple of kind of really good moments of that. But but in some ways it is quite similar. I think certainly compared to, if you look at it next to King of Kings and The Great Story Ever Told, and then compare that to, I mean, obviously The Passion of the Christ is an extreme, but any of the, but similarly, Last Temptation of Christ or various ones of other Jesus films that have happened since, and conversely ones that happened before, there does seem to be quite, I think there's quite a similarity between those three, because there's a kind of, it's a relatively short element of the story. It's not kind of dragged out as it is in some films. It's a relatively bloodless crucifixion, and there isn't much of kind of like really dwelling in the suffering aspect of it, I suppose. So I think more of the innovation always happens on the road to the cross than the actual cross scene itself. I mean, there is one shot that's talked about sometimes is in terms of that. There's a shot from behind the cross, which is kind of different from the more typical shot from the in front of the cross, and that kind of I can't remember now why that was meant to be significant, but it kind of, I suppose it chides in a little bit with some of the way that the crucifixion is shot or the crucifixions are shot in La Ricotta.
Yeah, I was thinking about that being on his mind, that he's parodied this idea of filming this, and then he's actually filming it, and he has to avoid the parody, or does he lean into it?
Yeah, I mean, one scholar talks about how he almost needed to make La Ricotta to get it all out, all that stuff out of his system, out of his his kind of like Sarky humor, his perhaps some of his anger, perhaps his desire to kind of, because I mean he was an art historian, he had a fantastic background in art history, and we see that crop up time and again in his work, but he almost kind of empties himself of all that stuff. So there's not very much really here, kind of classic Christian art history in this film, and so so that was. So it's almost like he kind of emptied all that, and then he could kind of focus on just this part of the story.
I mean, I think it's interesting as well from the Italian perspective, that this in Italian schools you do storia dell'arte, which is history of art, and more or less everyone does it, and it's all and because there are just so many exhibitions and so many churches with so many artists, literally everywhere. Kids go into these. Kids are absolutely dosed with this stuff, and I'm sure it was even more the case in Pasolini's time. I remember going to a place near Pisa, and there was a big Perugia. It was, and there was this big exhibition in like the municipal art gallery, and I went in, and it was like. It was the Madonna and Child, an exhibition, and we went through it, and there were literally like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of paintings of exactly the same subject, the Madonna and Child, Madonna. And it was kind of weird. At one point I was like, this is ridiculous. This is actually, it's like when you repeat a word so many times. Yeah. What's that called? Semantic aphasia, where you repeat it so much, it becomes meaningless. It's kind of the same thing, but then actually it kind of became genius, because you were sort of seeing all the little changes and the minor, and there was sort of an Andy Warholian sort of power to the repetition. So this, not only is Pasolini as a filmmaker making this film with a very broad and deep knowledge of sort of biblical scenes in Renaissance painting, but his audience, even his audience will be watching this with that knowledge and with those reference points. It's not going to be like, oh, we haven't seen this before. It will be new, it will be fresh, it will be vital, but it won't be unfamiliar.
No, I mean, I think that's very true, and and there is that kind of story that. The story is known through, and it's kind of such an apt metaphor in a way, because the story is so known through the visual art and through the visual portrayals, and and it's kind of interesting that there is I mean, various people have looked at this and tried to kind of draw out different artworks where he reflects, but he does largely seem to kind of try and do something new and try and do things in slightly new ways, and I think the fact that we kind of people talk about the hats, partly because they're so striking, but partly because they do have that. They are a kind of reference to these earlier works. But other than that, he does succeed quite a bit of doing things in a different way, I think. I mean, I'm less versed in all the all that kind of Italian historic Christian art than I'd like to be, and perhaps you know more about it with the.
No, I absolutely don't. I'm absolutely that's what I mean. Is like any 14-year-old kid here will know more about Italian Renaissance Christian art than I will, because they'll have already done 2 years of it at school.
Yeah,
and they'll already have had 3 or 4 field trips and what have you to you know. Well, even to the local church, you go to a local church in a relatively small town, and you'll see Titian or a Tintoretto or Giorgione or someone from that period. So to sort of wrap this up, your expertise is very much, as well as cinema in general, you've looked at these religious films in particular. Where does Pasolini's film stand in that tradition, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably it's probably the one that emerges as the best out of all those religious films. I mean, people have their own favorites, and people like different ones enough, and that's to do with kind of which ones work with people's theology. But I think it tends to be the one that is appreciated by most people from different perspectives, from a kind of film critic's point of view, certainly. And I think it's one of the films that really has a lot of ideas going on and is trying to say a lot of different things. So it kind of emerges as a real leader in that respect. Within kind of the Italian tradition as well, I think it becomes there's this sense with subsequent Italian Jesus films that there always seems to be a kind of a nod back to this film in a way that, like, even
Franco Zeffirelli's sort of mini series as well, Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, I think that's one of the interesting things, because there's perhaps less so with that film, but that film was a massive film at the time, and through the kind of 80s and 90s. But what you see when you come a little bit later is that some of the more subsequent filmmakers, it's the Pasolini one that they are kind of like making little nods to and referencing. Whether it's the kind of to do with the kind of style of it, or the kind of use of close-ups, or the kind of cinematography, and just all kinds of different elements. And Rossellini in a similar kind of, I mean, you kind of have this 14-year period where you get Pasolini makes this film, Rossellini makes Il Messiah, another Jesus film, as his last ever film, and you get Zeffirelli's one. But it's even with those kind of 3 great filmmakers and those 3 such admired works, it's Pasolini is the one that really stands out. And then I guess in terms of how it handles the text, there's just a whole. It handles the text in a very in an unusual way. So there's been other attempts to kind of film a single gospel word, absolutely word for word, which it probably won't surprise you and the listeners to know have not been particularly successful, because they're just not that kind of text. But very few films then decide, having decided not to go that route, most of them then go to the kind of, well, let's just bring all these different bits together and kind of make them into one amorphous story.
Tolstoyan sort of project. Let's just squish everything together.
Yeah, and cut and pasting. And we like this. We like the For God So Loved the World bit from John. We'll stick that in, and we like the parable of the Good Samaritan from So it's quite singular in that approach of just having that focus on the one gospel, and kind of both taking that gospel out of the context of the other ones, where it sits in the Bible, having that kind of single-minded focus, drawing the attention, I think, to what Matthew does as a writer. And so there's quite a lot of the little just things like the transitions between scenes and the way those things are put together, that kind of mirror the way kind of Matthew works linguistically as well. The kind of the jumps and the suddenness and the jarring, for example. And even things down to, like, I mean, the Sermon on the Mount is a much discussed scene, because you get, instead of with all the other Jesus films of the time, you have a great big mountain and you have a huge set piece around it, and then people sit there and listen, or stand there and listen. Here we get this kind of montage effect, and it's just on Jesus's face, but the locations, the weather, the time of day, all these things are changing, and that's a quite astute technical move in terms of kind of biblical criticism, this kind of source criticism, or whatever, because most scholars and don't think there was just like one sermon. It was kind of perhaps a compilation of his greatest hits, or alternatively that he used these same stories again and again, as most good circuit speakers do. They have their few things that they go around and repeat, and so it's a really clever way of portraying that. And that's a very the Sermon on the Mount is only a Matthew thing, and it's only and there's a kind of similar-ish version of Luke, but it's quite different. And so it's a unique project in that way, I think, because whereas they tend to kind of harmonize and perhaps put the focus very much on the idea that perhaps this is how it all happened, this film is much more about, this is a gospel that has had this effect over 2,000 years. I mean, Pasolini has this quote about wanted to reconstruct the life as it really was. I wanted to do the story of Christ plus 2,000 years of Christian history, Christian translation, and that really is what he does. There's still a focus. Jesus is still the central character. There's still that focus, but it's this. But also, you get much more of a sense of Matthew and what that the writer and what that gospel is like from this film than you do the others, where they're really trying to kind of reconstruct a kind of pseudo historical Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm gonna say, maybe you'll disagree with me, and if so, you'll have the last word. But I feel that Charles Bramesco wrote a review of the recent sort of faith-based action film that's just come out with, I think it's called The Code of Silence or something like that.
Is that the Jim Caviezel one?
Caviezel one, yes. Right. And it's all about it's all conspiracy theories and QAnon, but it's all been funded by faith-based right-wing organizations. And he says this is a film in the same way those family advice clinics are abortion centers. It's pretending to be a film to get you to go in so it can cover you with this propaganda. And now, to a lesser extent, I think a lot of religious cinema has that element, not necessarily as such a bad faith way, but the priority is evangelical rather than cinematic. And I feel with certainly I saw a few films in the 90s which were definitely being funded by church groups for that reason. But in this case, I really feel that the priority is level between cinema and the story, and that's what makes this like a masterpiece. This is a film which, if you're a Buddhist living in India, or it doesn't matter where you come from, this film is a masterpiece regardless of the context of the and whatever end power it has on you. So I really feel Pasolini's work has more than one masterpiece in it, but this is, as I guess I was saying at the very beginning, this is one that I would suggest people who haven't experienced his work would be well advised to begin with.
Yeah, I think I'd largely agree with most of that you've said. That it is, it's a film. It's a Jesus film made by one of the great directors, which is why I was so keen to come and talk about it, because he, as you say, he has several masterpieces. I think you've already done Cello. I'd maybe chuck Teorema in there, and maybe Lara Cotta as well. And I think in some ways, Pasolini's got his own agenda, and he's trying to kind of put that across as well. And in some ways, perhaps that puts him on in a trite way, that puts him on a par with with some of those more kind of evangelically minded films. But in another sense, he's an entirely, he is an artist, and not just in the sense that he's it's a way of proclaiming him as a director. He's literally a painter. He's first off, he's a poet and he's a writer, and there's this sense with him that he is choosing the artistic form that works best for what he's trying to explore and convey. And there's always a sense of contradiction with Pasolini in his films. There's always kind of contradictions, and this contamination thing that I mentioned earlier with him mixing things together. And so really, and because of that, I think it's that kind of tension and that wrestling and that genuine sense of exploration that really makes this, really makes this a film that isn't just about, I've got a point of view, I'm going to put it across, that it makes it a kind of genuine wrestling with, well, what would these things be like if we brought them together, and trying to kind of express something of himself and how he saw the world, and this striving, I think, for that kind of sense of the sacred. I mean, that underlines so much of his work, particularly his early work.
Absolutely. And just before we finish, last question. I'm very curious, and this is a little bit off topic, but I'm very curious as to what you feel about the anticipated release of Terrence Malick's The Way of the Wind, which is going to be and probably one of the greatest American directors addressing the Christ story again.
Yeah, I'm really, really curious to see it. I think it is. I mean, as you say, he's one of the great American directors. It's both. It's both impossible to know what it's going to be like, but also you kind of get a bit of a sense of what it's going to be like. I tend to like there's quite a few of the Jesus films where I like just the kind of slow approach, and Malick seems fairly likely that he will bring that to the table, and like Pasolini, he is another kind of artist that is seeking to bring something of himself to the material and kind of put a genuine kind of exploration of issues that he's trying to, I get the sense that he's been wrestling with for a long time. So I think it will be really interesting to see how he does it, how it links to his previous work. Obviously you're the expert in that respect, but from what I've seen, you imagine there will be quite a lot of joining with that, and and that trying to kind of express the inexpressible, I suppose. I think it'll be that kind of film. It'll be the kind of film that is trying to express the inexpressible. They'll put that on the poster probably, I reckon.
Yeah, expressing the inexpressible. What I like about his last film, A Hidden Life, there's a scene with a guy painting a church, and he has this speech about they don't want me to paint the real Christ. They want me to paint the comfortable Christ, the one that they can look up and say, if I had been there, I would have adored him, but the real Christ would be the one that they would all kill. And that as
I've forgotten that quote.
That as a hint makes me feel that we might be getting something which is more Pasolini and less King of Kings.
I think you're right on that. I think it'll be that kind of film, and it'll be really interesting to see that, how it works out.
Absolutely. Well, listen, thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Where can our listeners find your work? Where are you? What are you working on at the moment?
Well, I mean, I used to say Twitter, but,
or Threads.
Yeah, yeah. I haven't made it over there yet, but I've still got my blog. So if you Google Bible Films blog, that's there. There's my book, which you can get from all the usual places. 100 Bible Films. I've kind of been working as kind of contribution to a group of essays about similar films to this, which is that I've contributed a chapter on this film too. That'll probably come out in a couple of years. So watch spaces for that. But I think that'll be a really interesting book. And as I say on Twitter, I think on Bible Films on Facebook as well. There's me and a friend do that. So
brilliant.
So yeah.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Once more.
Thank you, Karen. It's been a pleasure.
Arrivederci ragazzi, ci vediamo in un prossimo film.
Lo speriamo.